Subscribe to Hollow Whisper Tales and unlock the secrets of the night. Title: The Cursed House on Black Hollow Road. Introduction: The shadows of Black Hollow Road. The winding path of Black Hollow Road cuts through the dense, foreboding woods of rural Pennsylvania like a scar, flanked by towering trees whose skeletal branches seem to claw at the sky. The road feels almost alive. Locals know better than to travel it after sunset. Those who do often speak of an oppressive silence that blankets the area, broken only by the faint rustling of leaves or something else moving in the dark. At the heart of this desolate stretch lies a relic of the past, a grand Victorian mansion, now withered by time and steeped in legend. Officially, it's known as the Hawthorne House, named after the man who built it in 1887. To everyone else, it's simply the Cursed House, abandoned for decades. Its once beautiful facade now rots beneath layers of moss and ivy. Shattered windows glare like empty eyes, and the porch, warped and sagging, groans with every gust of wind. It stands as a grim reminder of its dark past, a shadow of the opulence it once represented. The Hawthorne House wasn't always a place of fear. In its early days, it was the pride of Elijah Hawthorne, a wealthy landowner who sought to escape the bustling city life and retreat into the solitude of nature. But the solitude soon turned to isolation, and isolation to obsession. Elijah's peculiar behavior, long nights spent locked in his study, strange shipments of unmarked crates, and the faint sound of chanting, stirred unease among the few neighbors brave enough to visit. Over the years, whispers spread of dark rituals and strange disappearances tied to the property. When Elijah's wife and 2 daughters died under mysterious circumstances, the house's sinister reputation was cemented. For over a century, Black Hollow Road has been shrouded in stories of terror. Campfire tales tell of ghostly figures roaming the property, and disembodied whispers calling out to those who dare get too close. Teenagers brave enough to trespass report a crushing sense of dread as soon as they step onto the property. Some claim to have seen a shadowy man in a wide-brimmed hat standing in the windows, watching. Others speak of hearing the sound of a rocking chair creaking in the attic, even when the house appears empty. Despite its grim history, the Hawthorne House remained a magnet for curiosity. Paranormal investigators, urban explorers, and thrill seekers have all ventured inside, only to leave with chilling accounts of their experiences. Some describe the feeling of being watched, their skin prickling as though invisible eyes followed their every move. Others speak of sudden cold spots, objects moving on their own, or the sound of faint whispers urging them to leave. A few never returned, their abandoned cars later found on the roadside, doors wide open. For the locals, the house is more than just a source of spooky stories. It's a warning. They tell newcomers to steer clear of Black Hollow Road, especially at night, when the woods seem to close in and the air grows heavy with an unnatural stillness. It's said that once you've seen the Hawthorne House, you're never quite the same. Something about it clings to you, like a shadow you can't shake. In the summer of 1995, the Sullivan family learned this the hard way. James and Linda Sullivan, along with their 2 children, Kevin and Emily, had no knowledge of the house's dark history when they purchased it at a remarkably low price. For them, it was a dream come true, a chance to leave the chaos of city life behind and start fresh in the quiet countryside. The grandeur of the old Victorian mansion captured their hearts, and the rumors of its haunted past were dismissed as nothing more than local folklore. The Sullivans weren't the first to underestimate the legends surrounding the Hawthorne House, but they would be among the few to survive its horrors. What began as a hopeful new chapter quickly turned into a nightmare that would haunt them forever. The strange occurrences started small: misplaced objects, doors that wouldn't stay closed, and the faint sound of footsteps in empty rooms. At first, they laughed it off, attributing it to the quirks of an old house settling into itself. But as the days turned into weeks, the events grew darker, more insidious. The Sullivans soon discovered they weren't alone in the house. Something malevolent lingered within its walls, watching, waiting. The air itself seemed to hum with an unseen energy, and the family's once cozy home began to feel more like a prison. Linda awoke from vivid nightmares drenched in sweat, her screams echoing through the halls. Kevin, their teenage son, began waking with deep scratches on his arms, as though from unseen claws. And Emily, their youngest, started talking to someone she called Mr. Elijah, an imaginary friend whose chilling resemblance to the house's original owner would later leave the family shaken to their core. By the time the Sullivans realized the danger they were in, it was too late. The house had claimed them, wrapping its dark tendrils around their lives and pulling them deeper into its web of terror. What happened to the family during their brief time on Black Hollow Road would become one of the most chilling tales tied to the cursed house, a story of survival, loss, and the unrelenting evil that lingers in places where tragedy has taken root. As we unravel the harrowing events that unfolded, remember this: not all stories have a happy ending, and some houses are abandoned for a reason. The house's origins. The Hawthorne House was born out of ambition and secrecy. In 1887, Elijah Hawthorne, a wealthy but reclusive industrialist, left the bustling streets of Philadelphia to build his dream home deep within the Pennsylvania wilderness. Known for his stern demeanor and aloof nature, Elijah was a man who craved solitude, despising the social intricacies of urban life. His retreat to the countryside was not just about peace. It was about control. He wanted a home that would reflect his dominance over the land and the people around him, a monument to his power and wealth. The mansion he commissioned was no ordinary house. Designed in the Gothic Revival style, it loomed over the surrounding woods with an almost menacing presence. Its sharp gables and intricate ironwork cast jagged shadows on moonlit nights, while the tall, narrow windows gave it the appearance of a watchful, brooding sentinel. Inside, the house was a marvel of opulence. Ornate chandeliers sparkled in every room. Walls were adorned with rich mahogany paneling, and the floors were laid with imported marble. A massive library, rumored to house rare and forbidden texts, became Elijah's sanctuary. For the first few years, the Hawthorne family seemed to thrive in their isolated paradise. Elijah lived there with his wife, Margaret, and their two daughters, Eleanor and Abigail. From the outside, they appeared to be the picture of Victorian propriety, but whispers from the few workers and visitors who ventured onto the property suggested otherwise. Servants spoke of Elijah's erratic behavior, his fits of anger, his strange nocturnal habits, and the locked doors of his study, which no one was allowed to enter. Rumors spread that Elijah was involved in something far darker than business. Margaret, a delicate woman with a love for music, was often seen playing the grand piano in the parlor. Her melodies would drift through the halls, but as the years went on, those who visited noticed that her songs became slower and more mournful. Some claimed that she looked pale and withdrawn, as if the life was being drained from her. The daughters, once lively and full of laughter, became quiet and skittish, their once bright eyes clouded with fear. The first tragedy struck in the winter of 1892. Eleanor, the eldest daughter, was found dead in her bedroom. The official cause was listed as pneumonia, a common ailment during the harsh winters of the time. But something about her death felt off to those who knew the family. Neighbors whispered about her sudden decline, claiming she had seemed healthy just days before. Abigail, the younger daughter, was inconsolable, but her grief quickly turned to terror. She began speaking of a shadow man who came to her room at night, standing at the foot of her bed and whispering her name. Within months, Abigail too fell ill and died. Margaret was devastated by the loss of her children, and her health rapidly deteriorated. By the spring of 1893, she was bedridden, her once lilting voice reduced to a hoarse whisper. Some said they could hear her crying late into the night, pleading with someone or something to leave her alone. She died that summer, leaving Elijah as the sole occupant of the house. While the official records attributed the deaths to illness, the townsfolk believed otherwise. Many were convinced that the Hawthorne family had been cursed, though no one dared say it aloud to Elijah. Some speculated that Margaret and the girls had been victims of Elijah's strange experiments or occult practices. The house, with its eerie atmosphere and strange happenings, only fueled these rumors. In the years that followed, Elijah's behavior grew even more erratic. He rarely left the house, and when he did, he was often seen carrying peculiar items, candles, jars of strange powders, and carved wooden symbols. Workers who were hired to maintain the estate quit after just a few days, claiming they felt an oppressive presence within the walls. One gardener swore he saw shadows moving on the upper floors when no one else was supposed to be home. By 1898, Elijah had become a ghost of his former self. His once imposing figure was gaunt, his eyes sunken and haunted. He began writing obsessively in journals, filling pages with cryptic symbols and rambling about unlocking the veil. It was during this time that several townspeople went missing. A farmer who lived nearby reported hearing screams coming from the woods around the Hawthorne property. But when the sheriff investigated, he found no evidence of wrongdoing. Then, in 1901, Elijah Hawthorne vanished without a trace. One stormy night, the house was seen lit from within, every window glowing as if a fire raged inside. Neighbors who dared approach reported hearing chanting and the sound of heavy footsteps echoing from the house. But by morning, the mansion was silent, its windows dark. Elijah was gone, leaving behind only his journals and the eerie emptiness of the Hawthorne house. After his disappearance, the property fell into disrepair. No one wanted to live there, and the few who attempted to restore it quickly abandoned the effort. Stories of the Hawthorne curse grew with every passing year, fueled by the chilling accounts of those who ventured too close. Hunters claimed to hear whispers calling their names from the house, and children dared each other to touch its front door, only to flee in terror when they swore they saw a figure standing in the attic window. The house's dark legacy was cemented in local lore, becoming a place of fear and fascination. While Elijah Hawthorne's fate remains a mystery, one thing is certain. Whatever he left behind in that house did not leave with him. The Hawthorne house became more than just a crumbling mansion. It became a symbol of the evil that lingers in places where tragedy has taken root, and a warning to those who dare disturb what should remain forgotten. Local legends. The whispered fears of Black Hollow Road. Black Hollow Road has always been a place steeped in fear and mystery. Even before the Hawthorne house was built, the surrounding woods were avoided by local Native American tribes, who called it the place of silent shadows. They believed the land was cursed, a gateway to something dark and malevolent. Stories passed down through generations spoke of strange lights floating through the trees, voices calling out in languages no one could understand, and an unshakable feeling of being watched. Though settlers dismissed these tales as superstition, it wasn't long before they began to tell their own stories about the strange happenings on Black Hollow Road. After Elijah Hawthorne built his mansion in 1887, the legend surrounding the area grew darker and more specific. At first, it was whispered that the Hawthorne family had brought the curse upon themselves by disturbing the land. Neighbors reported hearing strange, melodic chants emanating from the house late at night, sometimes accompanied by the flickering glow of candlelight through the windows. These stories gave rise to the belief that Elijah was involved in occult practices, trying to summon or control whatever dark force lurked in the area. Even after the tragic deaths of Margaret, Eleanor, and Abigail Hawthorne, the rumors did not fade. In fact, they grew stronger. Local children claimed to see a woman in white walking along the edge of the woods at dusk, her face obscured by a veil of dark hair. She would stop to look at them, raising one hand as if to wave, before disappearing into the trees. Some believed this was the ghost of Margaret Hawthorne, searching for her lost daughters. Others thought it was something else entirely, something using her image to lure the unsuspecting into the woods. One of the most persistent legends involves the Shadow Man, a figure that multiple people have claimed to see in and around the Hawthorne house. Described as tall and thin, with a wide-brimmed hat that obscures his face, the Shadow Man is said to appear in the windows of the mansion at night, silently watching passers-by. Those who see him often report a feeling of suffocation or dread, as if an invisible weight presses down on their chest. A few brave souls who ventured onto the property claimed that the Shadow Man followed them, appearing in their dreams for weeks afterward. By the early 20th century, Black Hollow Road had gained a sinister reputation, and locals began to share stories of those who had dared to explore the Hawthorne house and returned forever changed. In 1923, a group of teenagers snuck into the house on Halloween night. Only one of them, a boy named Robert Mills, made it back. He was found wandering the road at dawn, his clothes torn and his hands scratched as if he had clawed his way through the underbrush. Robert never spoke of what happened that night, but his hair turned white within a year, and he spent the rest of his life avoiding the woods. Decades later, in the 1960s, a truck driver named Sam Holloway broke down on Black Hollow Road during a thunderstorm. With no other option, he decided to take shelter in the old mansion. Sam was a pragmatic man, not given to superstition, and laughed off the warnings he'd heard about the place. The next morning, his truck was found parked by the side of the road, engine still running, but Sam was nowhere to be found. The only clue was a single line of footprints leading from the truck to the front door of the Hawthorne house, and none leading back. Even those who never set foot on the property claimed to have experienced its influence. Residents of the nearby town often speak of hearing eerie sounds late at night, faint whispers carried on the wind, a woman's cry for help, or the echo of a child's laughter, though no children live nearby. Some claim the house's cursed energy extends beyond its walls, affecting anyone who strays too close. Farmers have reported livestock going missing, only for the animals to turn up days later in the woods, mutilated in ways no predator could accomplish. Another chilling tale involves the so-called Hawthorne lights. On moonless nights, strange orbs of light have been seen hovering near the house, bobbing and weaving as if they have a will of their own. Some witnesses have described these lights as hypnotic, claiming they felt an inexplicable urge to follow them into the forest. Those who resisted often reported hearing whispers in their ears, urging them to come closer. A few gave in to the temptation, and while most returned shaken but unharmed, some disappeared altogether, their fates unknown. Perhaps the most unsettling story tied to the Hawthorne house is that of the singing room. Urban explorers and paranormal investigators who have dared to enter the house often report hearing faint music, as if a piano were being played in the parlor. This music, described as hauntingly beautiful, seems to lure people deeper into the house, where the temperature drops sharply and the air grows heavy. One paranormal researcher described hearing a voice, soft, almost maternal, singing a lullaby in a language he couldn't understand. When he followed the sound to its source, he found an empty room with a broken piano, its keys covered in dust. Despite its reputation, the house continues to draw the curious and the foolish. Ghost hunters, thrill seekers, and skeptics alike are lured by the promise of experiencing something unexplainable, while some leave with nothing more than eerie photos or strange sensations. Others leave with far more: vivid nightmares, unexplained scratches, or a feeling of being watched that never quite goes away. The locals have their own theories about the legends of Black Hollow Road. Some believe the land itself is cursed, perhaps by the restless spirits of those who vanished in its woods long before Elijah Hawthorne arrived. Others are convinced that the house is a portal to another realm, a place where the veil between the living and the dead is impossibly thin. Whatever the truth may be, one thing is certain: the stories surrounding the Hawthorne house are more than just folklore. They are warnings, etched into the collective memory of the community, urging people to stay away from a place where the past refuses to rest. The Sullivan families move in. In the summer of 1995, the Sullivan family made a decision that would change their lives forever. James and Linda Sullivan, weary of the chaos and rising costs of city life in Pittsburgh, were searching for a fresh start. Their dream was simple: a quiet, idyllic life in the countryside with their two children, 15-year-old Kevin and 8-year-old Emily, could grow up surrounded by nature and tranquility. So when a realtor presented them with the Hawthorne house, a sprawling Victorian mansion at a shockingly low price, it seemed like fate. The Sullivans couldn't believe their luck. The photos showed a house with undeniable charm, intricate woodwork, stained glass windows, and a wraparound porch perfect for sipping lemonade on summer afternoons. Yes, the house was old and in need of some repairs, but James, a self-proclaimed handyman, saw it as an opportunity to make the home their own. Linda, an artist, was enchanted by the possibilities for decorating the space, and the children were thrilled by the idea of having so much room to explore. When they arrived at Black Hollow Road for the first time, however, the family's excitement was tempered by a sense of unease. The road leading to the house was narrow and winding, cutting through thick woods that seemed to block out the sun. As their car approached the property, the towering silhouette of the mansion came into view, casting long, jagged shadows across the overgrown yard. The once grand home had clearly fallen into disrepair. Shutters hung crooked, paint peeled from the walls, and ivy crept over the porch like skeletal fingers. Linda hesitated as they stepped out of the car. "It's big," she said, forcing a smile. Kevin, ever the sarcastic teenager, muttered, "Big and creepy." But Emily, with the innocence of a child, was enchanted. "It's like a castle," she exclaimed, twirling in the driveway. James clapped his hands together, determined to stay optimistic. "It just needs some love. We'll make it beautiful again." The realtor, a nervous woman named Diane, avoided looking directly at the house as she handed over the keys. "It has a lot of history," she said, choosing her words carefully. When Linda asked what she meant, Diane waved a dismissive hand. "Just old stories. You know how small towns are. People like to talk." She left quickly, promising to send over the paperwork, leaving the family to face their new home alone. As they began to unload their belongings, the house seemed to watch them, its empty windows like hollow eyes. The interior was even more imposing than the exterior. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs draped the high ceilings like tattered curtains. The air smelled faintly of mildew and something metallic, though no one could quite place the scent. Despite its neglected state, the house had undeniable character. Linda fell in love with the ornate staircase that spiraled up to the second floor, and James was already imagining the potential of the spacious kitchen. Kevin, however, was less impressed. He rolled his eyes at the creaky floors and dim lighting, retreating to the smallest bedroom he could find, declaring it the least haunted. Emily, on the other hand, was delighted. She immediately claimed a room with a bay window overlooking the woods, calling it her Princess Tower. The first few days in the house were uneventful, though unsettling. Small things began to stand out. The way the air always seemed cooler in certain parts of the house, or how the floorboards groaned even when no one was walking on them. Linda dismissed it as the quirks of an old home, but Kevin found it harder to ignore. He often caught himself glancing over his shoulder, certain he had seen a shadow move out of the corner of his eye. Then there was Emily. At first, her chatter about her new friend seemed innocent enough. "His name is Mr. Elijah," she announced at breakfast one morning, her voice light and cheerful. Linda smiled indulgently. "An imaginary friend, huh? What does he look like?" Emily tilted her head, as if considering. "He's tall and wears a hat. He says he used to live here." James and Linda exchanged a glance, but said nothing. Children had vivid imaginations, after all. Strange occurrences began to pile up. The first incident happened a week after they moved in. Linda was unpacking boxes in the kitchen when she heard the sound of footsteps on the stairs. "James," she called, but there was no reply. When she checked, the stairs were empty. Later that night, Kevin woke up to the sound of scratching outside his bedroom door. When he opened it, the hallway was silent, the air thick with an oppressive stillness that made his skin crawl. The oddities grew more frequent. Lights flickered even when the wiring had been checked and repaired. Doors that had been closed were found wide open, and objects disappeared only to reappear in the strangest places. Linda's favorite coffee mug, for example, vanished one morning and was later found balanced precariously on the edge of the bathtub. Emily, meanwhile, became increasingly withdrawn. She spent hours in her room, talking to her friend. Linda overheard snippets of her conversations, words that sent chills down her spine. "No, I can't go there. Mommy said I shouldn't." "Okay." But only for a little while. When Linda confronted her, Emily simply shrugged. "Mr. Elijah says it's okay. He says this is his house." The final straw came when James discovered deep scratches on the front door, as if an animal had tried to claw its way inside. The strange part was that the marks were on the inside of the door, gouged into the wood with such force that splinters littered the floor. That night, the family gathered in the living room, their unease palpable. "Maybe it's just settling," James offered weakly, but no one believed him. As the days stretched into weeks, the Sullivan family's dream of a peaceful life in the countryside began to crumble. The house, once filled with the promise of a fresh start, now felt oppressive, its walls closing in around them. Linda couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, and James's confidence started to waver as the unexplained events mounted. What they didn't know, what they couldn't yet understand, was that the Hawthorne house had chosen them. They had walked into its web, and the darkness within was only beginning to stir. The escalation, the sense of unease in the Hawthorne house, shifted into outright terror during the following weeks. What began as subtle, almost dismissible oddities soon grew into events that could no longer be rationalized. The Sullivans were no longer dealing with a creaky old house. They were living in a place where reality twisted, and the unseen seemed to push through into their lives. It started with the mirrors. One morning, Linda was brushing her hair in front of the antique mirror in the master bedroom when she noticed something strange. Her reflection seemed delayed. As she moved the brush, the reflection hesitated before mirroring her actions. She blinked, shook her head, and told herself it was just her imagination, but the incident stayed with her. A few days later, Kevin shouted for his parents to come to the bathroom. He stood there pale and shaking, pointing to the fogged-up mirror above the sink. Scrawled across the glass were the words, "You don't belong here." The house seemed to come alive at night. Footsteps echoed down the hallways, heavy and deliberate, always stopping just outside the family's bedroom doors. The rhythmic sound of knocking started on the walls, always 3 taps at a time. followed by long silences. James tore through the house looking for the source, hammer in hand, but never found anything. The oppressive air of the house thickened, suffocating them with a weight they couldn't see, but could feel pressing down on their chests. Emily's behavior grew increasingly disturbing. She stopped eating at the dinner table, preferring to take her meals to her room. She would sit in the bay window for hours, staring out into the woods, sometimes whispering softly to herself. One night, Linda walked past Emily's room and heard her laughing. When she peeked inside, she saw Emily sitting on the floor, her head tilted as if listening to someone. "What's so funny, sweetheart?" Linda asked. Emily turned to her with wide, unblinking eyes. "Mr. Elijah told me a joke," she said matter-of-factly. Linda froze. "Emily, there's no one here but us." Emily just smiled and went back to whispering, leaving her mother shaken. The tension between James and Linda began to mount as well. James, who had been so optimistic about fixing up the house, was growing irritable and paranoid. He spent hours in the basement, obsessively checking the foundation and electrical work, muttering that something felt wrong about the house. Linda tried to keep the family together, but she too was fraying at the edges. She started waking up in the middle of the night, convinced someone was standing in the corner of the room. The feeling was so strong that she would turn on the lamp and stare at the empty corner until she convinced herself it was nothing. Kevin, ever the skeptic, tried to ignore the strange happenings, but even he couldn't dismiss the things he experienced. One night, he woke up to find his bed shaking violently. At first, he thought it was an earthquake, but when he looked around, nothing else in the room was moving. The shaking stopped as suddenly as it started, and he spent the rest of the night sitting in the corner of his room with the lights on. Another time, as he was listening to music on his headphones, he caught a glimpse of something in his peripheral vision. Turning, he saw a shadowy figure standing in the doorway of his room. It was tall and wore a wide-brimmed hat, its face obscured. Kevin yanked off his headphones, but the figure was gone. By now, the family had stopped talking about the strange events. Each member was isolated in their own fear, afraid to voice their experiences for fear of being dismissed, or worse, believed. The house had them exactly where it wanted them, fractured, vulnerable, and scared. Then came the night everything changed. It started with a sound, faint at first but growing louder. It was music, soft, haunting, and unmistakably from a piano. Linda and James were startled awake and rushed downstairs to the parlor, where the old piano sat untouched. The keys were moving on their own, striking a slow, melancholic tune. The moment James stepped into the room, the music stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the faint sound of Emily's laughter from upstairs. They found Emily in her room, standing in front of the mirror, her hands pressed against the glass. "Emily, what are you doing?" Linda asked, her voice shaking. Emily turned to face them, her expression eerily calm. "He wants me to stay," she said. "He said it's better here." Linda grabbed Emily and pulled her away from the mirror, but as they left the room, the mirror cracked from top to bottom with a loud, splintering sound. James, his patience finally breaking, shouted, "Enough! Whatever's in this house, you're not welcome here." His words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and charged. The response came almost immediately. The walls trembled, picture frames crashed to the floor, and the lights flickered violently. A guttural growl echoed through the house, so loud it seemed to vibrate through their bones. Kevin came running down the stairs, his face pale and his hands shaking. "We need to leave now," he said. As the family scrambled to gather their things, the house seemed to fight back. Doors slammed shut on their own, blocking their paths. The growling sound was joined by faint whispers, dozens of voices overlapping in a sinister cacophony. Kevin tried to open the front door, but it wouldn't budge. "Dad," he shouted, tears streaming down his face. "I can't." James charged at the door with his shoulder, slamming into it until it finally burst open. The family spilled out onto the porch, gasping for air as the night swallowed them. They didn't stop running until they reached their car, leaving the house standing silent and foreboding behind them. As they drove away, Emily sat in the back seat, staring out the window. When Linda glanced back at her, she saw something that made her blood run cold. In the reflection of the car's rearview mirror, Emily's face wasn't her own. It was someone else's, a gaunt, pale figure with hollow eyes and a twisted grin, uncovering the truth. After fleeing the house that night, the Sullivans sought refuge in a nearby motel. Exhausted, terrified, and emotionally drained, they huddled together in a single room, too shaken to sleep. The events of the night replayed in their minds, each family member grappling with their own unanswered questions and lingering fear. By morning, James decided they needed answers. "Whatever is happening in that house, someone has to know," he said, pacing the small room. "We can't just leave without understanding what we were dealing with." Linda, still clutching Emily close to her, hesitated. "What if knowing makes it worse?" she asked softly. But James was resolute. The family drove to the local library in the nearby town of Elmsford, hoping to uncover any history about the house. The librarian, a middle-aged woman named Martha, perked up when James mentioned Hawthorne House. Her expression quickly turned grim. "You're not living there, are you?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. When James explained their ordeal, Martha sighed and led them to a back corner of the library, where dusty records and newspapers were stored. "Hawthorne House has a dark past," she said, lowering her voice as if the walls themselves might be listening. "It was built in the late 1800s by a man named Elijah Hawthorne. He was a recluse, a wealthy landowner who moved to the area under mysterious circumstances. People in town said he practiced strange rituals. He rarely left the property, and those who visited often spoke of feeling uneasy. Some said the house itself seemed alive." James furrowed his brow. "What happened to him?" he asked. Martha hesitated. In 1898, a fire broke out in the house. The flames destroyed most of the west wing. Elijah's body was never found, but people claimed they saw him standing in the window as the fire raged. Since then, every family that has lived there has left under unusual circumstances, or worse. There are rumors of disappearances, strange illnesses, and even deaths. Linda shivered, clutching her arms. "Why wasn't this mentioned when we bought the house?" Martha shrugged. "Most people around here know to stay away. I suppose your realtor thought you'd hear the stories eventually, but it sounds like you had to experience it firsthand." She pulled out a yellowed newspaper article with the headline, "Tragedy at Hawthorne House. Family of 4 disappears." The article detailed the disappearance of the Harrison family in 1974. They had purchased the house and moved in with high hopes, only to vanish one stormy night. The house was found empty, save for a single, chilling detail: claw marks gouged into the floor of the children's bedroom, much like what James had discovered on their front door. "No bodies were ever found," Martha added. As the Sullivans dug deeper, they found more stories. A young woman in the 1920s was found hanged in the parlor, though her death was ruled a suicide despite claims from neighbors that she'd been terrified of the house. A couple in the 1950s reported hearing their names whispered at night, their belongings rearranged while they slept. They left after only 6 months. The most disturbing detail, however, came from a handwritten journal entry Martha unearthed from the archives. It was written by a Reverend Samuel Green, who had been called to the house in 1901 by its then owner, a widow named Margaret Tilson. Margaret claimed the house was cursed and begged the reverent to cleanse it. Reverend Green described an overwhelming malevolent presence in the home and wrote of seeing shadowed figures darting across the walls. He concluded his journal with the ominous line, "This house is no ordinary place. It is a doorway." The word lingered in the air like a dark cloud. Doorway. What does that mean? Linda asked, her voice trembling. Martha looked at her solemnly. Some believe Hawthorne House is more than haunted. They think it's a conduit, an opening to something darker, something beyond our world. James, ever the pragmatist, struggled to process this. You're saying the house itself is a gateway. To what? Martha shook her head. That's something no one can fully explain. But the stories, they point to something evil. And if what you've told me is true, it's not just the house that's dangerous. Whatever is inside doesn't like to let people go. Kevin, who had been quiet throughout the conversation, suddenly spoke up. Emily kept talking about Mr. Elijah. She said he told her things, showed her things. Martha paled. Elijah Hawthorne, she murmured. It said he never left the house, that he's still there waiting. The Sullivans exchanged uneasy glances. James clenched his fists, his frustration boiling over. So what do? Burn it down? Get an exorcist? Martha shook her head again. If Reverend Green couldn't cleanse it, I doubt anyone can. But if you're smart, you'll stay far away. The house has a way of calling people back. And if you're not careful, she didn't finish the sentence. But the implication was clear. The family left the library feeling no closer to a solution, but their fear had deepened. As they drove back to the motel, Linda noticed Emily staring out the window, her expression distant. What are you thinking, sweetheart? She asked, brushing a strand of hair from Emily's face. Emily didn't look at her. He doesn't want us to leave, she whispered. Linda's heart sank. What do you mean? Emily turned to her, her eyes filled with a sadness far too old for an 8-year-old girl. He said we're his now, that we belong to the house. That night, James stayed awake, sitting by the door with a bat in hand, his ears straining for any sound. He couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't safe, not even here. The house might be miles away, but its grip on them had not loosened. And in the darkness, as the clock struck midnight, Emily began to hum a soft, familiar tune, the same haunting melody they had heard on the piano in the Hawthorne house. The final night. The Sullivans spent their final night in Elmsford with the oppressive weight of fear looming over them. The knowledge they had uncovered at the library seemed to make the haunting even worse. Despite their distance from the house, it felt as though its sinister energy had followed them. Linda was the first to notice the signs. As the family prepared for bed in the cramped motel room, she saw faint scratches on the inside of the bathroom door. They hadn't been there when they arrived. The pattern of the marks was eerily familiar, 3 jagged lines, like the ones on the front door of the Hawthorne house. She didn't mention it to the others, unwilling to add to the already thick tension. Emily, who had been eerily quiet since leaving the house, seemed to grow more withdrawn as the hours passed. She sat cross-legged on the bed, staring at the wall with a blank expression. Linda tried to coax her into talking, but Emily would only respond with vague, unsettling phrases. He's waiting, she whispered at one point, her voice distant. He doesn't like that we left. James, restless and on edge, paced the room with his phone in hand, dialing numbers of realtors, exorcists, and even local law enforcement, desperate for guidance. No one had an answer. We'll leave in the morning, he muttered under his breath, more to himself than to anyone else. We'll go somewhere far away, somewhere he can't find us. Kevin sat by the window, watching the parking lot below. He had barricaded the door with a chair, despite the motel's heavy lock. Every now and then, he thought he saw movement in the shadows outside, a fleeting figure, a flicker of something that disappeared the moment. He turned to look directly at it. As the clock struck midnight, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The air grew colder, and an unnatural stillness settled over them. It felt as though the world outside had stopped. No cars drove by, no crickets chirped, and even the hum of the motel's neon sign seemed muted. Then it began. A low, guttural growl emanated from somewhere within the room. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder with each passing second. The family froze, their eyes darting around the room. James grabbed the bat he had brought from the car, his knuckles white as he gripped it tightly. "Stay together," he whispered. The growling was followed by a slow, deliberate knocking on the motel room door, 3 knocks, each louder than the last. Kevin jumped to his feet, his breath coming in short gasps. "Don't open it," he said, his voice trembling. "We're not going anywhere near it," James replied, stepping in front of Linda and Emily. The knocking stopped, and for a moment there was silence. But then the walls began to shake. The paintings on the wall rattled violently, and the overhead light flickered erratically. The growling grew louder, mingling with faint whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Emily suddenly began to hum. It was the same haunting melody they had heard on the piano in the Hawthorne house. Linda grabbed her shoulders, shaking her gently. "Emily, stop, please." But Emily's eyes were glazed over, her expression vacant. The whispers grew louder, turning into disjointed words. "You cannot leave," they said, their voices overlapping in a chilling chorus. The temperature in the room plummeted, and visible puffs of breath escaped their mouths as they huddled together. Then the mirror above the dresser cracked. A long, jagged line splintered across the glass, and from the crack, a dark, shadowy mist began to seep out. It swirled and coalesced in the center of the room, forming a figure, tall, gaunt, and menacing. Its face was obscured, but its presence was unmistakably evil. James raised the bat, his voice trembling as he shouted, "Stay away from my family." The figure didn't move, but seemed to tilt its head as if amused. Then, with an otherworldly speed, it lunged at James. Linda screamed as the bat flew from James's hands, landing with a clatter across the room. James was thrown against the wall with a force that knocked the wind out of him. The figure turned its attention to Emily, who was now standing, her small frame eerily still as she stared at it. "Emily, get back!" Linda cried, but Emily didn't move. Instead, she extended her hand toward the figure. "No," Linda sobbed, grabbing her daughter and pulling her close. "You can't have her." The figure loomed over them, its presence so suffocating that Linda felt as though she couldn't breathe. Kevin, summoning every ounce of courage he had, grabbed the bat and swung it at the figure. The bat passed through it as though it were smoke, but the action seemed to disrupt its focus. The figure recoiled slightly, its form flickering. "Everyone to the car!" James shouted, pulling himself up from the floor. The family scrambled to the door, yanking it open and racing outside. The air was thick with an unnatural fog that hadn't been there moments before. They piled into the car, and James started the engine with shaking hands. As they sped away from the motel, the figure appeared in the rearview mirror, standing in the middle of the parking lot. Its dark silhouette remained motionless, but its presence was palpable, even from a distance. Emily turned in her seat, watching it until it disappeared into the fog. "He's not gone," she said softly. The family drove through the night, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and the house. But no matter how far they went, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. Linda held Emily tightly, tears streaming down her face as she whispered a silent prayer. James gripped the steering wheel, his jaw clenched in determination. Kevin sat in the back, gripping the bat as though it might still protect them. As dawn broke, the first rays of sunlight brought a fleeting sense of relief, but deep down they all knew the truth. The nightmare wasn't over. Whatever evil resided in the Hawthorne house had marked them, and it wasn't done with them yet. Aftermath. The Sullivans thought the worst was behind them when they escaped the motel and left Hawthorne House far behind. For weeks, they stayed on the move, refusing to settle in one place for too long. They traveled through several states, avoiding major cities, and rarely spending more than a few nights in the same location. Yet, no matter how far they traveled, they couldn't escape the shadow that seemed to follow them. Linda spent her nights lying awake, listening for whispers in the darkness. James became more irritable and withdrawn, obsessively planning their next moves. Kevin, once an easygoing teenager, grew quiet and watchful, his bright spirit dimmed. And Emily, sweet, innocent Emily, was no longer the child they once knew. She spoke less and less, her gaze often vacant, her humming of that haunting melody a constant reminder that something still lingered within her. Signs of the curse. It started subtly, as if the house was testing them. At a roadside diner in Nevada, Linda found strange symbols scratched into the wood of their booth, symbols she had seen in the Hawthorne house basement. Kevin began waking up with inexplicable bruises on his arms, as though he'd been grabbed in his sleep, and Emily's humming began to evolve into whispered conversations at night, her voice soft but unsettlingly familiar. James tried to rationalize it all. "We're just on edge," he said one night as they huddled in a small cabin they'd rented in the mountains of Colorado. "This is stress, plain and simple." But his denial crumbled when Linda showed him the claw marks that had appeared on the cabin door, identical to the ones they'd first found on their home in Hawthorne. The family realized that whatever malevolent force had haunted the house wasn't confined to its walls. It had attached itself to them, like a parasite feeding off their fear and despair. Seeking help, desperate for answers, the Sullivans turned to experts. They contacted paranormal investigators, spiritual healers, and even clergy members, hoping someone could help them sever their connection to the house. One investigator, a man named Richard Crow, came highly recommended by a paranormal society in California. When he arrived at their temporary rental in Arizona, he immediately sensed the heavy energy surrounding the family. "You're marked," he told them bluntly. "Whatever is attached to you is powerful and very old. It doesn't want to let go." Richard performed a series of rituals, burning sage and drawing protective symbols around the house. For a brief moment, the atmosphere seemed lighter, and the family dared to hope they were finally free. But that night, Emily woke them all with a blood-curdling scream. They found her standing in the center of the living room, her eyes rolled back, her small hands outstretched as if reaching for something unseen. Her voice, distorted and unnatural, echoed through the room. "You can't stop him. He's coming." The next morning, Richard left, pale and shaken. "I've dealt with many hauntings," he told James quietly before he drove away. "But this is beyond anything I've ever encountered. I'm sorry, but I can't help you." The fracture. As the months dragged on, the family began to fracture under the strain. James blamed himself for buying the house in the first place, and his guilt turned to anger. He snapped at Linda over small things and withdrew from Kevin and Emily entirely. Linda, meanwhile, became consumed by her own guilt. She spent hours researching the occult, trying to find a way to break the curse. She rarely ate or slept, her once warm demeanor replaced by a cold determination. Kevin started avoiding the family altogether, spending his days wandering the towns they passed through, hoping to escape the oppressive atmosphere of their temporary homes. He grew increasingly resentful of his parents, blaming them for uprooting their lives and exposing them to the evil that now haunted them. And Emily. Emily seemed to fade further into the shadows with each passing day. She spoke less, her once vivid personality replaced by an eerie stillness. Sometimes, Linda would catch her staring at nothing, her lips moving silently. And always, there was the humming, the melody that had become a harbinger of dread. The breaking point, the final straw, came one stormy night in Texas. The family had rented a small farmhouse on the outskirts of a quiet town, hoping the remote location would bring some peace. As the rain battered the windows, the power went out, plunging the house into darkness. James lit candles while Linda checked on the kids. She found Kevin sitting by the window, staring out at the storm, his face pale. "There's someone out there," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Linda peered into the darkness but saw nothing. "It's just the storm," she said, though her own voice trembled. But Kevin shook his head. "No, he's watching us." Before Linda could respond, they heard Emily's voice from upstairs. It wasn't a scream or a cry for help, it was laughter, high-pitched and unnatural. It echoed down the stairs, sending chills through them. They found her sitting in the middle of the attic floor, surrounded by old, dust-covered toys that didn't belong to them. She was playing with a doll, humming the melody, her face lit by the flickering light of a single candle. "Emily," Linda whispered, her heart pounding. Emily looked up at her, smiling, a smile that wasn't her own. Her eyes, dark and unrecognizable, glimmered with a malevolent intelligence. "You can't leave him," she said, her voice overlapping with another, deeper one. "You belong to him now." James, panicked, grabbed Emily and carried her out of the attic, shouting for Linda and Kevin to follow. The family piled into the car once again, leaving behind their belongings and the farmhouse itself. A grim resolve. As they drove away, the rain finally stopped, and the first light of dawn broke through the clouds. But the Sullivans felt no relief. They knew, deep down, that they could never outrun the evil that had claimed them. For the first time, James spoke what they had all been fearing. "Maybe we can't escape this," he said, his voice hollow. "Maybe the only way to end it is to go back." Linda shook her head vehemently, tears streaming down her face. "We can't. We'll lose everything." James's eyes met hers in the rearview mirror, filled with a quiet, grim determination. "We already have." The Sullivans realized that their nightmare wasn't over. It would never be over until they confronted the darkness waiting for them at Hawthorne House. Conclusion. The chilling tale of the Hawthorne House on Black Hollow Road is a profound reminder of the dangers lurking beneath the surface of history. As the Sullivans learned, some places harbor secrets that should remain buried. The house, with its Victorian charm, drew them in with promises of nostalgia and restoration, but it concealed a darkness that transformed their lives forever. The events that unfolded serve as a cautionary tale, warning us about the perils of ignoring history and the forces that can linger long after their creators have passed. In exploring the intricate layers of the Hawthorne House's past, we confront the very nature of fear. Fear in its many forms, fear of the unknown, fear of loss, and fear of the dark, holds a powerful sway over us. For the Sullivans, the initial thrill of inhabiting an old house quickly turned into a nightmare. The cold spots, the whispers, and the inexplicable occurrences became reminders that some histories are not easily forgotten. Every creak of the floorboards echoed with the weight of the past, transforming a once inviting home into a haunting echo chamber filled with memories and regrets. The sense of dread that permeated the house became a character in its own right, an unseen force that relentlessly pursued the family. Linda's vivid nightmares and Kevin's unexplained scratches illustrate how fear can manifest physically, affecting not just the mind but the body as well. The family's gradual descent into terror shows how the paranormal can blur the lines between reality and the supernatural, leaving them questioning their sanity. As their experiences escalated, the Sullivans found themselves trapped in a cycle of fear and disbelief, struggling to reconcile the house's dark history with their desire to create a loving home. The house's origins, built by Elijah Hawthorne, a man consumed by obsession and tragedy, remind us that the past is never truly past. The rituals he practiced and the lives lost under suspicious circumstances haunt the very foundations of the home. Local legends whisper of the horrors that transpired within its walls, echoing the timeless battle between those who seek to uncover the truth and those who prefer to leave it buried. The connection between the house and the disappearances of townsfolk paints a grim picture, revealing how the past can haunt the present and cast a long shadow over future generations. As urban explorers venture into the abandoned Hawthorne house, they seek thrills and encounters with the unknown, but they are also reminded of the risks associated with delving into the eerie remnants of history. The reports of cold hands grasping shoulders and disembodied growls resonate with those who dare to tread where others have faltered. The house stands as a testament to the thin veil separating the living from the dead, a reminder that curiosity can lead to dark places. Those who disregard the warnings and legends do so at their own peril, often leaving with more than just a ghostly story to tell. The enduring fascination with the Hawthorne house and its spectral inhabitants invites us to reflect on our own relationship with fear. Why do we seek out that which terrifies us? The answer lies in the complexities of human nature. We are drawn to the unknown, captivated by the allure of stories that challenge our understanding of reality. The house on Black Hollow Road symbolizes our innate curiosity, but it also serves as a warning that some truths are best left undiscovered. Moreover, the Sullivans' experience prompts us to consider the importance of history and the stories we inherit from those who came before us. Every old house holds the echoes of its past, and the lessons learned from them can guide us through our own lives. Ignoring history can lead to repeating mistakes, and the haunting of the Hawthorne house exemplifies this idea. By acknowledging and respecting the past, we can navigate our future with a clearer understanding of the forces that shape our reality. The tragic fate of the Sullivan family and the haunting legacy of the Hawthorne house serve as a poignant reminder of the fragile nature of our existence. As they fled the house, abandoning their belongings, they left behind not just material possessions, but a part of their lives forever altered by the dark history entwined within those walls. The house now stands as a shell of its former self, a monument to the struggles of those who dared to call it home, and a canvas for the imaginations of those who encounter its legend. In conclusion, the haunting tale of the Hawthorne house encapsulates the enduring fascination and fear surrounding places imbued with history. It urges us to tread carefully when exploring the unknown, and to heed the warnings embedded in local lore. The legacy of the Sullivans, the whispers of Elijah Hawthorne, and the stories passed down through generations remind us that some houses are best left undisturbed, their secrets untouched. As we contemplate the nature of fear and curiosity, we must recognize the power of history and the stories it holds, for they shape our understanding of the world and our place within it. The Hawthorne house may be abandoned, but its haunting presence will linger in the hearts and minds of those who dare to listen to its tale, forever echoing the lessons learned from a past steeped in darkness. Subscribe to Hollow Whisper Tales and unlock the secrets of the night.